Good morning. This is Mike McGrath in my workshop to share with you a few tips for the Scout Victory Garden at Akridge concerning early starts for some of your vegetables that are going to go into your garden plot. There's been an expression of interest from some of our gardeners in some tips on starting plants indoors, so I'm going to take a couple minutes this morning and give you a couple ideas. First, I'd like to talk about direct seeding into a pot, or in this case, I'm going to be using Jiffy 7s, the little pellets that rehydrate. And these are available from different companies, but the Jiffy company makes ones that I've been using for years. And here's a special little tray, not expensive. You can buy these online through Amazon. I'll try to put a link in this video so that you might want to order some of these. But these are trays that are specially made for the Jiffy 7s. Here's what the Jiffy 7s look like. They're a little flat pellet, looks like a checker, hard when they come. And these trays are designed specifically so they have a slot that holds one of these little pellets just perfectly. And you also notice it has little connecting drain holes, and the pellets are held just slightly, just a couple of millimeters above the bottom of the plastic flat. And this allows you to rehydrate, to soak these, and then to keep them watered from below, which is important. We don't want to wash out little fine small seeds. So we can put them in there like that. And then, of course, one of the things that they include with these trays is a little lid that turns this into a little greenhouse that holds the moisture and the temperature that you want to maintain pretty nicely. And so what I've got here is some that I've already rehydrated. And you'll notice now these have raised up vertically probably 5 times their original height. And I just soak these with slightly warm tap water. What I like to do in that tap water is put just a couple of drops of a wetting agent. And when I say wetting agent, we don't want to use strong detergents, so leave your Dawn or some of those things out of the mix. Just a little hand soap like Ivory soap would be fine. I happen to use a material from Shackley called Basic H, which is a mild wetting agent. And perhaps you've got something similar that you use that doesn't have strong detergents. And then once I've filled this up and allowed these to rehydrate, I left this so there's just a tiny amount of water throughout this whole tray, filling those little grooves, and that just kept these hydrated now for several days. And then this lid just went on top, and you'll notice that the condensation inside indicates that it's kept the humidity very high. Now, these are perfect for direct seeding. By that I mean we're going to put the seeds that we want to grow directly into these, what could be pots, if you wanted to fill some peat pots. And I'll show you some other things you can do that are sort of homemade, do it yourself. But where we're going to put these seeds directly, and they're going to grow in these. Now, that's a little different than transplanting, which I'll get to in a couple minutes. So let's take a look about some seeds that I want to plant. And right now, I've got a few summer squash seeds. This is probably a little early for those, but hey, you know, I'm an optimist. And so we want to cover seeds about 3 to 4 times their thickness. And so something the size of a summer squash seed needs to be pressed down a little bit into this pot. And let me just show, I'm going to put one in there, and I'm going to put another one in there too, because my germination is not probably going to be 100%. And then I'm just going to pull that mixture that these are included in on top of that seed. So it's about 3 or 4 times the thickness of that seed is covered. Let me do another one, a couple here. So I'm going to put a couple in that little center area. I'm going to press them down a little bit, and then I'm going to pull this top mixture, some mixture on top, make sure they're completely covered like that. And so that's how I would plant something like a cucumber seeds. Cucumbers would be a little smaller, wouldn't have to be covered as deep as these are being covered as summer squash. But then these are going to germinate here. And one of the things we need to keep in mind as they germinate, and some people might be interested in temperature, it varies. I think I sent around previously, either last year or this year, a planting schedule that also had some recommended temperatures. But these are going to have to be, most of our vegetable seeds can be kept at about 65 degrees, 65 to 70, which is probably your household temperature. They need good light, of course. So if you have indoor lighting, some people have been putting LED lights about 3 to 4 inches above the trays. Works pretty good. You don't need grow lights necessarily. A lot of these new LED strip lights or other LED type lights are giving us a good balanced light spectrum. And of course, if you got a window where they get sun for most of the midday, we'll say, without getting too hot, you might want to put a little thermometer in here and make sure we're not getting much over 75 or 80 at the best, at the highest. And so until these start to germinate, and then what we're going to look for is what we call the primary leaves of the cotyledons, if you want to be technical. The first seed leaves that open up for most of our cotyledonous plants, like the summer squash, will be two sort of fat, chubby little leaves that come up. And then later, the leaves will change to the regular leaves that, of course, come above that. Now, something like a deeply rooted plant like squash or cucumbers, we probably want to plant about 4 to 5 weeks ahead of our planting time. For something like tomatoes that have a more fibrous root, or green peppers, we can let some of those go until they're 7, 8, 9 weeks old. Again, if we've got proper temperature, not too warm, and plenty of light so we don't get leggy, tall, weak plants. In fact, for tomatoes and even peppers, at least green peppers, bell peppers, not necessarily hot peppers, I like to see the temperature then reduced once they've changed their leaves to the primary leaves down to about 55 or 60, about 10 degrees warmer than we were keeping them, 10 degrees cooler rather than the warmer temperatures we're keeping when they're germinating. So there's some direct seeding. I'll probably fill this up with some other seeds here today, put that lid on. Now I want to show you some other ways, a little cheaper. Here's a takeout food box. During the pandemic, maybe you've got a collection of these like I have. And look, some of these are just about perfect for a germination container. In fact, I really like this one. It's got ribs at the bottom. So again, if I put, let me grab a few more of these Jiffy 7s. If I put them in here, just like that commercial tray, it keeps it up off the bottom so we get a little bit of drainage, but yet we could rehydrate them in here just fine. So that's kind of cool. I like that idea, and these look pretty good. We would rehydrate those again, and we've got a lid while they're rehydrating, and then this one I like because it really snaps on nice, and we've got a nice tall, in fact, it's just a smidge taller than this commercial version, so it gives a nice place for the plants to grow on. Although a lot of these, you probably want to remove this, at least most of the time, once they get up good, so we don't, again, get too much leggy, too warm, too humid growth in there. But something like the Jiffy 7s are great because they're sterile. We don't have to worry about damping off or fungus diseases. They're easy to store. We don't have to fool with mix. I kind of like those for a lot of my direct seeding efforts. But we can also do it even in things like, our egg carton, which in Scouts we've learned to use egg cartons for a lot of things. I like the paper ones because they sort of absorb, and later you could probably even cut these apart, and if you were careful about making sure they were thoroughly wet and maybe pinching a few holes in them, you could do some direct planting, just like we're going to do with the Jiffy 7s, where we get ready to put those in the field. We're going to plant Potinol, or in that case, Pelletinol. Here we could even do it with this, again, tearing out the bottom of this when it's thoroughly wet and soft after a few weeks of growing plants in here. This would work for you. To cover it while it's germinating, we just use some saran wrap or even some excess plastic wrap that you got sitting around, or maybe you've got another plastic dome that's part of something you've saved. You could put over top of this. We wouldn't want to close it like that. In fact, I'd probably want to cut this off and just use the bottom. And then another possibility, we can use either our professional trays or something like, here's another food takeout tray with a lid. This from the Bavarian Bakery. We've been being bad during the pandemic. But this, let's talk for a minute a little bit about doing some transplanting. Direct seeding we've covered. Let's do some transplanting. Now for transplanting, I need to have this well drained. I don't want this to get... So I'm going to take my Scout knife and I'm going to cut a few drainage slots in here. And then I'm going to also then put this probably in another tray so the water doesn't go all over my house or something. Now if you're outdoors or you've got a place where you don't care about the water draining through the bottom, that's fine. But probably the places where we're going to keep this warm, we'd want to do that. And then in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to fill this with some potting mix. Now I've got some professional pro mix here that I'm going to use today, which I like. When I was running greenhouses and doing hundreds of thousands of transplants, actually, we used a lot of pro mix. And these commercial mixes, look for the ones that say starting mix. We don't want to use the growing mix because the fertility, the amount of fertilizer in those mixes is going to be too high for our little seedlings as they're sprouting. And so growing mixes for starting seeds are both generally finer and have less nutrients in it to better accommodate the needs of young plants. Now they're going to be transplanted, and so we can start, once they're transplanted, we can add more nutrients on a regular basis through either a liquid fertilizer or maybe make a manure tea or a compost tea by soaking some of our poultry mulch that we've got there. It's really mulch at this point at the garden. You could grab a few handfuls of that and soak it in a bucket for 5 or 6 days, and then take the dark compost water that comes off of that, manure tea, some people call it, use that to feed your plants. But right now, we're going to put those seeds in here for transplanting. Now, the kinds of vegetables we're going to transplant are the fibrous roots seedlings that are going to transplant well. We wouldn't want to transplant our summer squash. We must direct seed them. The type of roots they have are just not make them very adaptable to transplanting. We're likely to have them die as their root system is disturbed. And so things like cucumbers, squash, cantaloupes, some of those vegetables, fruits, we want to have them in the pot or in the cube or in the place, whatever it is, an egg carton or whatever, that it's going to go directly into the field with as little root disturbance as we can manage. Now, of course, we also, when it warms up in the last part of May, early June, we can plant those directly in the field, of course. But if we want to get that early start, then we don't want to transplant those. We want to direct seed them and then move them without disturbing into the field. But plants like tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, cabbage, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, these are all fibrous rooted plants that transplant pretty well. And so we can plant them in a setting like this. Now, this is kind of damp. We want to make sure it's not just bone dry. In fact, I usually prefer taking a few handfuls that I'm going to use to create a seed flat, wet it a little bit until it makes a ball when I squeeze it, but when I squeeze it, no water comes out. In other words, it's thoroughly damp but not wet. And then when we put it in here, we can transplant, or put our seeds in here for transplanting. Now, one of the things, again, we have to observe the depth. And so if we did some tomato plants, tomato seeds, we'd want those to be just 3 or 4 millimeters deep groove or row for these. And how do we do that? Well, we can just simply take a stick, or you can just take your finger and make a few rows. We want them a couple of inches apart, 5-6 centimeters. And then we're going to scatter the seeds in here. And then what I recommend is using something to cover them that rather than pulling the dirt over it and disturbing everything, it's kind of a mess to do that. Once we've got our little rows or grooves, we put our seeds in there at the proper depth. And then we either come back with some of this mixture and very carefully scatter it over the top of the seed. And then when we're done, what I like to do is just take the back of my hand and just lightly tamp that down to make the seed in good contact with the soil above and below. And then we're going to water this just very slightly, not till it's flooded, but until it's just thoroughly dampened. And then we're going to, again, come back with a cover on here. Keep these seeds at 65 to 75 degrees until germination. Then we're going to want to give them a little bit more air and space as they come up. And we're going to watch for those leaves to change. And when, for example, a tomato plant, usually somewhere about 15 to 20 days after planting, once those initial pair of leaves have been replaced with the primary leaves, and you'll see that then they branch out with tomato-looking leaves, then you're ready to transplant. And then you're simply going to carefully root those up, loosen them, and then move them into something like pre-soaked Jiffy cubes. Jiffy 7s work fine, those tablets, or pots filled with soil, or maybe your egg carton could come back into use, filled with some soil, and then put plants in there. After they then grow another 3 or 4 weeks, usually I think tomatoes, if they're kept at the right temperature with good lighting, in 7-8 weeks, they're ready to go into the field. You should have a nice, tall, 4 to 6 inch tall plant that's strong, got a thick stem, not gangly or leggy, and you should be ready to go into the field. So that's a 2-step process: planting, then transplanting into a pot or some other container to go in the field. Or like our grandfathers did, if you have a little bit larger container probably than this, deeper, they grew tomatoes all the way up until they were 5 or 6 inches tall, loosened them and took the so-called bare root plants out to the field and planted those. Now we found that they get a better start in the field when you use something like some of these pellets or a jiffy pot, a peat pot filled with mixtures like this. They can just get a better start, not so much root disturbance. You're likely to not get wilt down, and they just perform better. And then when going into the field, transplanting them into the field, we always want to have a little bit of weak fertilizer solution, either your compost tea, manure tea, or maybe some 20-20-20 liquid soluble fertilizer that you mix according to directions in your watering can. Water around those new transplants in the field, that'll give them a really good start. One thing I also wanted to mention, maybe buying the soil mixtures or the jiffy pellets, we can save not only by using some of these food boxes, but we can make our own soil mixtures. And there's lots of ideas you can get on the internet about what a good soil seed starting mixture you make on your own. Some people use 1/3 peat moss, 1/3 perlite, 1/3 garden soil, and then mix that well and screen it through a 1/4 inch screen. And then it needs to be sterilized if it has garden soil in it, because it's going to have fungus in there that's going to cause potentially, in fact likely, damping off, which means when your seeds emerge, the plants are going to get a black ring around their stem and fall over and die. And to avoid that, the mixture has to be sterile. You can sterilize it at home in the oven, and I'll put a link below with some instructions on how to do that. A lot of people don't want to fool with all that, and a small bag of Pro Mix or Jiffy Mix for starting seed. Again, we want to make sure it's for starting seed. Is a way, without a great deal of expense, that you don't have to worry with using your oven to cook a soil mixture. But if you like to do it yourself stuff, that might be a way for you to go. And I'll try to put links in this video also in the description of places on the internet where you can get ideas about mixtures and how to sterilize them at home. So I hope that this has given you some ideas about how to start seeds indoors, get a jump on the year. Look at the planting time chart that I included before. I'll put another link to that here as well. We don't want to get started too early, because one of the dangers, unless you have your own greenhouse or some kind of window greenhouse or something like that, is that you're going to wind up with plants that are too leggy and too tall before it's warm enough to go outside, and then they're going to take a setback, and your results aren't going to be nearly as good. So you want to time the planting and transplanting and movement of the plants into the field with the expected dates on which plants are able to go into the field without being damaged by frost. We have to be particularly careful with tomatoes, peppers, particularly hot peppers, some of the other tender perennials, which is really what tomatoes are. Most people don't know that, but they're actually a perennial. They'll be killed by the frost or freezes. And we can't dependably know in the Dover area that there won't be any frost until about the first or second week of May. Gardening always has its risks, like farming. It's a statistical game, and people trying to get the earliest tomatoes sometimes find their very first ones get frost killed, and they have to come in with a few more that they've kept back in reserve. I usually tell people that are not willing to take risks or first time or early amateurs, 10th of May, I would not plant any tomatoes or tender pepper plants in the field until the 10th of May. Now you can get another couple days earlier by using baskets or other kind of coverings. You may see in my plot that I use a wax paper tent called king caps or hot caps that go over top of the plants that you've put in. But again, people come up with all kinds of methods to do that. Well, I hope this has been helpful. I hope you get an early start with your garden this year, and I look forward to seeing you out at Akridge. Have a great day. Bye.